Tonight, we begin the story of a man who once said, "In a gentle way, you can shake the world." His life came to embody that idea through stillness, simplicity, and a steady commitment to truth. You may already know his name, Mahatma Gandhi, a name taught in classrooms, etched in statues, printed on currency, echoed in movements far beyond the land of his birth. But before the honorifics, he was simply Mohandas, a quiet child, a hesitant young man, shaped less by certainty than by years of searching and slow transformation. His life was never easy, but it was deliberate. Even the smallest acts, what to wear, what to eat, when to speak, were weighed with care. He was born in Western India in the late 19th century, into a family of administrators and merchants, raised in a household of faith and order. From an early age, he was drawn to meaning. He wrestled with guilt, fear, and expectations he could not yet name. Slowly, across continents and decades, he began to shape an idea of who he was and what he was meant to do. As we trace his life, we'll walk through the events that shaped nations, as well as looking at some of the lesser-known moments as well. This is not a story of triumph. It is a story of devotion, of a man who tried each day to live by his values and to become, slowly and imperfectly, an example of what might be possible when conviction is guided by compassion. Let's get started. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was born on October 2nd, 1869, in the seaside town of Porbandar, along the western coast of India. The house of his birth was modest, but his lineage was not. He came from a family of administrators, serving as Diwan, chief minister, in a succession of small princely states under British suzerainty. His father, Karamchand Gandhi, was a respected and serious man, devoted to public duty, but known also for his calm demeanour and strong sense of justice. His mother, Putlibai, was deeply religious, a woman of devotion whose life was governed by fasting, prayer, and service. From her, young Mohandas would inherit more than spiritual habits. He absorbed her stillness, her discipline, and the belief that every act, no matter how small, carried moral consequence. She belonged to the Vaishnavite tradition of Hinduism, worshipping Lord Vishnu, but also drew from the principles of Jainism, non-violence, vegetarianism, and the idea that truth must be lived, not merely spoken. Mohandas was the youngest of 4 children. A sensitive and somewhat timid boy, he did not excel in school, nor did he make a strong impression in his early years. He was afraid of the dark. He avoided fights. He spoke softly. Teachers sometimes overlooked him, but there was something in him that endured, a kind of inwardness, a natural tendency to observe more than to act, to reflect more than to speak. As a child, he wrestled with guilt more deeply than most. When he stole a bit of gold to pay off a small debt, he was so overwhelmed with remorse that he confessed in a letter to his father. The older Gandhi, touched by his son's honesty, tore up the note and said nothing. It was not a scolding that shaped Mohandas, it was forgiveness, and that moment would remain with him, tucked away in memory, a simple reminder of the strength that can be found in compassion. At the age of 13, Mohandas was married in an arranged union to Kasturba, a girl just a few months older than he was. Like many children of their time and caste, neither fully understood what marriage meant. It was a rite of passage, a tradition carried out by families rather than feelings. And yet, over the years, through trials both ordinary and profound, she would become his partner in far more than name. In the years that followed, Gandhi's life was relatively unremarkable from the outside. He studied dutifully, though without distinction. He followed the rules, though not without rebellion. He fasted occasionally, watched his mother pray, and tried to make sense of the moral and cultural expectations around him. India, at the time, was a land of deep tradition under foreign rule, its villages steeped in ritual and rhythm, its cities increasingly shaped by the machinery of empire. He grew up under the shadow of British power, though like many in his position, he accepted it as a given rather than a grievance. In school, he studied English and arithmetic alongside Sanskrit scriptures and religious texts. His voice was small, his body was thin, but something was forming beneath the surface, a way of thinking that did not separate the personal from the political, or the sacred from the practical. Years later, Gandhi would say that his real schooling began not in classrooms, but in observation. His early life, shaped by restraint and ritual, gave him a deep familiarity with the idea that control of the self was the first and most difficult form of freedom. As he grew older, the pressures of expectation began to settle on his shoulders. His family wanted him to become a barrister, a lawyer who could represent their caste with dignity and perhaps carry on the administrative legacy of his father and grandfather. And so, at the age of 18, Mohandas Gandhi prepared to leave India for the first time. His destination was England. His purpose, to study law. His hope, though he may not have spoken it aloud, was to discover who he really was, beyond the roles, beyond the rituals, beyond the silence. He would pack few belongings. He would carry with him the memory of his mother's blessings and his father's firmness. And as the ship pulled away from Bombay harbour in the autumn of 1888, Gandhi stood at the edge of the deck, staring out at a world he could not yet imagine. What he would find on those distant shores would not be greatness, not yet, but it would be the beginning of his search for identity, for integrity, for a way to live in truth. The voyage from India to England took weeks, crossing vast expanses of ocean and unfamiliar cultures. For Mohandas Gandhi, just 18 years old, the journey marked more than a shift in geography. It marked the beginning of a gradual unravelling of who he had been and the tentative formation of who he might become. He arrived in London in the fall of 1888. It was damp and grey, foreign in every imaginable way. The customs, the food, the dress, the tempo of life, it all moved differently than the world he had left behind. And Gandhi, raised in a deeply traditional household, felt the dissonance immediately. He had promised his mother he would not eat meat, would not touch alcohol, and would do his best to remain true to the spiritual practices of his upbringing. But in a city filled with stewed meats, social drinking, and secular thinking, these commitments quickly became tests of will. At first he tried to blend in. He bought a top hat. He took elocution lessons to refine his accent. He practiced his handwriting and tried to learn the subtle codes of English social life. There was a deep loneliness in those early months, a sense of being not quite from anywhere. He was too Indian for the British students around him, yet not quite Indian enough to feel fully at home with the few fellow countrymen he met abroad. He was adrift, but it was in this space of tension that Gandhi began to build a different kind of foundation, not one based on imitation, but on introspection. While studying law at the Inner Temple, one of London's prestigious legal societies, Gandhi also began to explore new dimensions of thought. He became involved with the London Vegetarian Society, where he found practical support for his dietary vows, and also a group of thinkers and reformers who introduced him to Western philosophy, ethics, and alternative spiritual traditions. He read widely and with quiet intensity. The Bhagavad Gita, which he had known only faintly as a cultural text in his youth, began to speak to him with new clarity when read through the lens of personal discipline and moral struggle. He explored Christian scriptures, especially the New Testament, and was drawn to the Sermon on the Mount, which seemed to echo the principles of humility and non-violence he was beginning to value more consciously. He also encountered the writings of Henry David Thoreau, Leo Tolstoy, and John Ruskin, thinkers who questioned materialism, championed simplicity, and saw social reform as a moral imperative. These texts stirred something in Gandhi, a slow aligning of intuition with philosophy. He did not yet know what his beliefs would demand of him, but he was beginning to understand that belief without action was not enough. Ethics, he realized, could not remain theoretical. They had to be lived. Outside the libraries and meeting halls, however, Gandhi remained somewhat isolated. He kept largely to himself, walking through foggy streets with books tucked under his arm, writing letters home, and occasionally reflecting on his inner turmoil. The pressure to succeed in his legal studies weighed heavily, as did the expectation of his family, who had borrowed money to support his journey. He feared failure, not just academically, morally as well. He feared losing the thread of who he was. Still, there were small victories. He learned to prepare his own meals. He kept to his vow of abstaining from meat and alcohol, despite the temptation and social awkwardness it sometimes caused. He grew more comfortable in solitude and began to see it as a kind of clarity. London remained cold and unfamiliar, but he no longer felt the need to fully belong. Instead, he began to observe with a kind of humble curiosity. By the time Gandhi completed his law degree in 1891, he had changed, not into someone new, but into someone more aware of what he was becoming. He was still soft-spoken, still unsure of his place in the world, but something within him had solidified. His time in England had not given him a sense of mastery. It had given him a framework, a way of thinking that would one day become a way of living. He returned to India that summer, full of ideas but with little sense of how they might take root. His legal qualifications did not translate easily into success. He struggled to find clients, stumbled through his first cases, and questioned whether he had misunderstood his calling entirely. And then, in 1893, a letter arrived. A simple offer, a 1-year legal assignment in South Africa. He accepted it quickly, with little sense of what awaited him on the other side of the world. It would be there, in a place he had never imagined, that Gandhi would face the moments that began to awaken his public conscience. It wasn't in a courtroom, nor in a lecture hall, but on a train, in the middle of the night, in a place that told him he did not belong. In 1893, Gandhi set sail once more, this time southward, toward the unfamiliar coasts of South Africa. He had been offered a modest legal contract with an Indian firm in Natal, and though the assignment was meant to last just 1 year, it would ultimately span over 2 decades. It was in South Africa that Gandhi would come to know injustice, and also resistance. The man who had left Bombay was still searching for direction. The man who had returned to India years later would be something altogether different. He arrived in Durban as a young barrister in a crisp suit, equipped with a British education and a belief in reason. But South Africa introduced him quickly and without ceremony to a different kind of reality. On a train ride shortly after his arrival, Gandhi was seated in a first-class compartment. Though he held a valid ticket, a white passenger objected to his presence, and the conductor insisted that he move. Gandhi refused. The police were called. He was thrown off the train in the middle of the night at Pietermaritzburg and left to shiver alone in a dark station, cold and bewildered. That moment became something more than a personal insult. It was a rupture, a signal. Gandhi later said that as he sat there, in that lonely outpost of empire, he began to question everything: his identity, his rights, and the acceptance he had carried for so long. He realized that dignity was not something given, but something claimed, and that law, for all its logic and structure, could be deeply unjust when shaped by prejudice. South Africa's Indian population was small but growing, largely composed of indentured labourers and traders. They lived under harsh restrictions, denied voting rights, subjected to curfews, and humiliated by petty laws meant to enforce racial hierarchy. Gandhi, with his legal training and fluency in English, soon found himself gainfully employed and very much needed as well. He began to represent fellow Indians in court, to write petitions, to speak on their behalf, and slowly, almost without planning, he became their voice. He founded the Natal Indian Congress in 1894, bringing together merchants, clerks, and labourers in a shared effort to fight discrimination. At first, he believed in the power of persuasion, in the idea that if he could explain the injustice clearly enough, British authorities would see reason. But South Africa did not change quickly, and Gandhi, while never abandoning dialogue, began to develop something more enduring than protest, a philosophy of opposition, grounded in veracity rather than force. He called it satyagraha, a Sanskrit word that translates loosely to truth force. The approach he employed wasn't simply passivity, as often mistakenly thought. Rather, it was a vigorously applied self-control. It meant holding firmly to what was right, even in the face of punishment. It meant disobeying unjust laws openly and with dignity. It meant accepting suffering without retaliation. For Gandhi, it wasn't just a political tool, it was a moral path. Gradually, Gandhi's methods hardened into something more practiced. He was arrested for the first time while encouraging others to resist a new registration law, and later imprisoned again for refusing to carry official documentation. He never shouted, he never ran. When forced into a cell, he simply bowed his head and complied. What changed was not the clarity of his beliefs, but the depth of his willingness to endure them. Over the next several years, Gandhi's commitment to satyagraha would be tested repeatedly. He organised campaigns against oppressive laws, including a new ordinance that required all Indians to register and carry identification at all times. Those who refused faced imprisonment or deportation. Gandhi encouraged mass civil disobedience. Thousands joined him. He was arrested more than once, beaten and jailed. Though resentment didn't fuel the escalating protests, unwavering determination did. Outside the courtrooms and protest meetings, Gandhi's personal life was evolving as well. He brought his wife, Kasturba, and their children to South Africa, where they joined him in what became a new kind of life, one shaped by simplicity, austerity, and service. He established the Phoenix settlement near Durban, a cooperative community grounded in shared labour and spiritual reflection. Later, he would found Tolstoy Farm near Johannesburg, named after the Russian writer whose ideas on non-violence and moral living had deeply influenced him. At these settlements, Gandhi and his companions experimented with communal living, vegetarian diets, daily prayer, and manual work. He spun his own cloth, cleaned latrines, and gave up many material comforts. His days became shaped by rhythm rather than urgency, by habit rather than ambition. He began to strip away not only physical possessions, but the layers of ego and identity that, in his view, clouded the path to truth. Kasturba, often quiet in the background, became a steady force, supporting him through illness, prison terms, and public scorn. She too was arrested for her role in civil resistance, and endured it with the same dignity Gandhi had come to expect from those he led. Their relationship, often strained by his rigorous expectations, remained grounded in shared purpose. Gandhi's views were not universally admired. Some accused him of moral rigidity, of asking too much from followers who had little to give. Others felt his methods were too slow, too idealistic in the face of brutality. But Gandhi believed that how one struggled mattered just as much as why. For him, the process was the outcome. The means were the message. By the end of his time in South Africa, he had been arrested more than once. His moustache had greyed at the edges. He no longer argued. He simply endured with a kind of steadiness that made punishment feel like ritual. Sometimes he was released, sometimes not, but the effect was the same. No one knew quite what to do with him. By the early 1910s, his efforts had begun to bear fruit. Some discriminatory laws were repealed. The Indian community, once fragmented by class and religion, had found new unity. And Gandhi, now in his 40s, began to feel that his work in South Africa was nearing completion. He had not overturned the system, though he had proven that ordinary people, through discipline and solidarity, could push back against injustice. He had also proven something to himself, that courage need not be loud, that leadership need not be authoritarian, and that strength could emerge from gentleness. These were lessons he would carry back with him to India, a nation he had left as a hesitant young man and would return to as something else entirely. In 1915, after 21 years in South Africa, Gandhi boarded a ship home. He did not know then that the path ahead would make him one of the most recognizable figures in modern history. He knew only that the path was not yet finished. When Gandhi returned to India in 1915, he was not a household name. He had spent over 2 decades abroad, and while his work in South Africa had been followed by some in political circles, the Indian masses knew little of the man in simple white cloth who now stepped off the boat. He was greeted with respect, but not yet with reverence. At first, he did not launch into speeches or claim leadership. Instead, he listened. He travelled the country by train, often in third-class compartments, sitting among workers and farmers, teachers and shopkeepers. He visited villages where poverty was deep and systemic, where British rule was not just an idea, but a daily weight. In time, this period of observation became its own form of learning. Gandhi came to understand India not as a single nation, but as a patchwork of needs, languages, castes, and hopes. He met Gopal Krishna Gokhale, a respected elder statesman of the Indian National Congress, who advised him to move slowly and build trust. Acting upon this counsel, Gandhi dedicated his initial years to community service rather than immediate activism. He founded ashrams, communities centered on manual labor, prayer, and self-reliance. In Gujarat, at the Sabarmati ashram, he began to cultivate a way of life that would become synonymous with his name: simple, austere, devoted to truth. His own cloth on a charkha, the spinning wheel that would become both a symbol and a practice. He cleaned his own latrine, walked barefoot, and wore only hand-woven garments. It was not a performance. It was, for Gandhi, a moral necessity, a daily reminder that freedom would mean nothing if it did not begin with the self. By 1917, Gandhi's role began to shift from observer to organiser. The British Raj, confident and unyielding, continued to extract resources and enforce obedience. But small sparks of resistance were beginning to gather into something larger. Gandhi's first major campaign in India was in Champaran, Bihar, where poor farmers were forced to grow indigo under exploitative conditions. When Gandhi arrived, he was not welcomed by officials. He was ordered to leave. Instead, he stayed. He interviewed villagers, documented abuses, and organised peaceful protests. His method was not confrontation, but insistence. He disobeyed quietly, and when arrested, refused bail. The case against him was eventually dropped. More importantly, the government was forced to make concessions to the farmers. This was followed by a similar campaign in Kheda, Gujarat, where crop failure had left peasants unable to pay taxes. Gandhi advocated for tax relief, organised volunteer efforts, and encouraged non-violent defiance. Once again, the outcome was modest reform, but the symbolic power was enormous. Ordinary Indians were beginning to believe that they had agency. Then, in April of 1919, came an event that would send shockwaves through India and change the course of Gandhi's approach forever. In the city of Amritsar, in a garden known as Jallianwala Bagh, a peaceful gathering became the site of sudden violence. Thousands had come, some to protest new colonial laws, others simply to sit and pray. The garden was enclosed by high walls, with only narrow entrances. British troops, under the command of General Dyer, blocked those exits and opened fire. No warning was given. There was no call to disperse. For 10 minutes, the gunfire echoed through the narrow space. When it stopped, hundreds were dead. More lay wounded. Gandhi was devastated. Until then, he had believed that non-violent protest would awaken the conscience of the British government. That injustice, once revealed, would lead to reform. But this was something deeper. It was not misunderstanding. It was something colder. And so, with quiet sorrow, he called off the campaign. India was not ready, he felt, not for the kind of non-violence he envisioned. There was still too much fear, too much anger, too much temptation to meet violence with rage. From that day forward, Gandhi's commitment to ahimsa, non-violence, would not waver. He would carry the memory of Jallianwala Bagh with him, not as a cry for revenge, but as a solemn vow. He would not forget Amritsar. He would let its pain deepen his discipline. Over the next decade, Gandhi would lead boycotts of British goods, particularly cloth, encouraging Indians to spin and wear khadi, homespun fabric, as a symbol of self-reliance. He urged people to withdraw from colonial institutions, to resign from titles and jobs granted by the British, to replace dependence with dignity. These were not only political gestures, they were spiritual exercises. For Gandhi, true independence, Swaraj, was not merely the removal of foreign rule, it was the removal of fear, of passivity, of internalized subjugation. In 1930, after years of petitions, negotiations, and restrained protest, Gandhi chose a new target for civil disobedience: salt. It seemed almost too simple. Salt was ordinary, ubiquitous, it could be gathered from seawater or bought for a few coins, and yet under British law it was heavily taxed, controlled by monopoly, and forbidden to be produced or sold by anyone but the colonial government. The poorest Indians paid the same rate as the wealthiest, and in that injustice Gandhi saw opportunity. He announced his plan with clarity. He would walk from his ashram in Sabarmati to the coastal village of Dandi, about 240 miles away. There he would bend down, gather a handful of salt from the shore, and break the law. It would be a symbolic gesture, simple and non-violent, but it would carry a message: that Indians had the right to the resources of their own land. That colonial rule, no matter how bureaucratic in appearance, was fundamentally extractive. On March 12th he set out. He was 61 years old, thin and grey, wearing only his homespun cloth sandals and carrying a bamboo staff. He was joined by a small group of companions, followers, volunteers, and reporters. Each morning they rose early and walked beneath the warming sun. Villagers lined the roads, offering food, water, and shelter. During his trips, Gandhi frequently spoke about the salt tax and equally how crucial it is to treat everyone with respect. He also spoke about self-rule and the importance of discipline in the face of oppression. The procession grew. From a few dozen, it became hundreds, then thousands. The walk was not a march in the military sense. There were no chants, no uniforms, no banners, only bare feet, dust, and unshaken determination. Gandhi stopped in schools, temples, and village squares, listening as much as he spoke. He encouraged people to spin their own cloth, to resist British goods, and to prepare themselves, not for battle, but for restraint. Each step was a lesson, each mile a meditation. The Salt March was not only a protest, it was a performance of principle, a movement in slow motion, meant to show that resistance did not require aggression. That change could arrive not through force, but through moral clarity. On April 6th, after 24 days on the road, Gandhi reached the sea at Dandi. He stepped into the surf, bent down, and picked up a crust of salt left behind by the tide. That was all. No speech, no fanfare, just an old man at the edge of the ocean, performing an illegal act with absolute calm. But the world took notice. The image of Gandhi at the shore travelled far. In India, thousands followed his example. Women and men across the country marched to the sea, boiled seawater, and produced their own salt. In other cities, peaceful protests began. British authorities responded with mass arrests. Nearly 60,000 people were jailed. Gandhi himself was arrested soon after. But the spirit of the march could not be contained. It was not only about salt anymore. It was about sovereignty, self-respect, the sense that a country could rise not by copying its oppressors, but by choosing a different way. The Salt March revealed something deeper about Gandhi's strategy. He understood that symbols matter, that when politics fail to inspire, a single act, simple, accessible, and dignified, can awaken the imagination. He had not just challenged the law, He had made a statement that anyone could join. No weapon was needed. No permission was required. He was invited to the Round Table Conference in London soon after, an attempt by the British to negotiate with Indian leaders. Gandhi went. He spoke. He walked through English streets, dressed as always in his simple cotton shawl. But the negotiations stalled. The British were not ready to let go. Even so, Gandhi had shown that protest could be both gentle and powerful. That suffering, when chosen deliberately, could unsettle even the most hardened rulers, and that a march, conducted in silence and barefoot across dusty roads, could echo louder than any shouted demand. The march had taken just a few weeks, but its effects would ripple for years. For all the marches and speeches, the protests and arrests, the life Gandhi lived on the public stage was only part of the story. Beneath the surface, beneath the spinning wheel, the speeches, the salt and slogans, was a far more private struggle, a daily effort to align his outer actions with his inner beliefs, to make his life itself the message. He called it his experiment with truth. It was something to be tested constantly, refined by failure, reshaped by experience. He did not believe in arriving at certainty. He believed in moving toward it, slowly and with humility. This pursuit shaped every part of his existence. He gave up personal comfort, wealth, and adornment. He wore only simple cotton garments, spun by his own hand, even during meetings with kings and prime ministers. He walked barefoot whenever possible. He fasted often. It wasn't intended to punish himself. It was to sharpen his awareness, to purify his intention, to remind himself of the suffering of others. He took a vow of celibacy in his late 30s, choosing to channel his energy away from desire and into service. It was not an easy vow. He had been married since he was a teenager. He loved Kasturba deeply, though he could also be exacting and uncompromising in his expectations. Their relationship was not without strain. She followed him into protest, into prison, into hardship. She endured not only the British, but the demands of a husband whose vision often required sacrifice from those closest to him. Still, she remained beside him, quietly resolute. Where Gandhi intellectualized suffering, she lived it, raising their children, keeping their household afloat during his long absences, fasting with him, marching with him, growing old alongside a man who increasingly belonged not to her, but to the world. In 1944, after decades of shared life and shared struggle, she died in prison, with Gandhi at her side. He was heartbroken. He said little about it publicly, but those who knew him understood that her death left a silence that would never quite lift. Discipline shaped his days. Prayer at dawn, chores done by hand, meals prepared simply. He believed that to speak of justice while living in excess was hypocrisy. That self-rule could not be achieved by people who had not yet learned to rule themselves. And so he trained his body, his impulses. He monitored his thoughts. He kept journals. He reflected constantly on how to live in accordance with his values, through the smallest acts of daily life. Yet this commitment to principle brought conflict as well. In the broader independence movement, new voices were emerging, louder, more impatient, less bound to the philosophy of non-violence. Jawaharlal Nehru, younger, educated in England, envisioned an industrial, secular India. Subhas Chandra Bose, charismatic and militaristic, believed in armed resistance. Gandhi respected both men, but he did not always agree with them. His vision of India was not built on factories or armies. It was built on villages, on self-sufficiency, on moral authority. Some found him stubborn. Others saw him as out of step. They admired his sacrifices, but questioned whether his methods could still lead a nation hungry for change. Even within the Congress Party, his influence was no longer absolute, and yet time and again, Gandhi remained the moral reference point, someone to whom the nation turned in moments of crisis. He did not have all the answers, but he had never stopped asking the right questions. He did not ignore his critics. He listened, and often reflected deeply on their words. But he believed that true leadership required integrity more than popularity. He was not swayed by fashion. He was not animated by power. What mattered to him was whether his actions remained in alignment with his conscience. That was the only standard he trusted. Still, he was not immune to doubt. In letters and private writings, he sometimes questioned himself. Had he done enough? Had he asked too much of others? Was non-violence still sufficient in a world growing more violent by the day? These were not signs of weakness, but of someone who understood that conviction, without reflection, can become its own form of tyranny. His critics said he was idealistic, but Gandhi never claimed to be a saint. He once said that he was a practical idealist, a man guided by principle, but grounded in action. He made mistakes, he apologized when he was wrong, he changed his mind when persuaded, but he never stopped striving to live as he taught, even when it was difficult, even when it meant standing alone. There was something in Gandhi that resisted finality. He did not believe in endings, only in progress. He did not expect perfection, only honesty. And though his life was deeply structured, he did not see truth as fixed. It was a horizon always receding, always inviting pursuit. By the time India was on the verge of independence, Gandhi was no longer at the centre of every decision. But he remained its conscience. His spinning wheel, his fasts, his unwavering belief in the power of love and sacrifice, these remained constant, even as the world around him changed. And though the political world was growing louder, faster, more complicated, Gandhi's daily rhythm continued. Prayer at dawn, walking among villagers, listening more than he spoke. He had become a symbol, but he remained at heart a seeker. The path he had chosen was narrow. It demanded much, but it also illuminated something that power could not offer. The unshakable clarity of a life lived in service of something greater than the self. That clarity would be tested one final time in the days to come. On August 15th, 1947, India awoke as a free nation. After nearly 2 centuries of British rule, the Union Jack was lowered, and the Indian tricolour rose in its place. In Delhi, crowds cheered, leaders gave speeches. Pandit Nehru, soon to be Prime Minister, stood before a sea of people and declared that India had kept her tryst with destiny. But Gandhi was not there. He had declined all invitations to attend the celebrations in the capital. There were no flags in his hands, no speeches prepared. Instead, he spent that historic day not in Delhi, but in Calcutta, a city scarred by communal violence. Hindus and Muslims had killed one another in the streets just weeks earlier, and though the worst had quieted, the tension remained like smoke after fire. Gandhi chose to walk among the people rather than stand beside the powerful. He visited homes that had been looted, prayed in neighbourhoods where mobs had once roamed. He listened more than he spoke. He carried no security. His presence was the only protection he offered. And remarkably, in those days, the city grew still. The man who had led a nation to freedom without ever firing a bullet now stood in its most fragile places, simply trying to hold the pieces together. For Gandhi, independence had always meant more than political sovereignty. It was about inner freedom, freedom from fear, hatred, division. And though India had finally broken its chains, he sensed that it had also torn itself in the process. Partition had come as part of the price of freedom. With British withdrawal came the division of the subcontinent into 2 nations, India and Pakistan. It was a line drawn in haste, slicing through Punjab and Bengal, separating neighbours, friends, families. What followed was among the largest human migrations in history. More than 10 million people crossed borders in both directions, Hindus and Sikhs fleeing from what was now Pakistan, Muslims fleeing from what remained India. The scale of the upheaval was staggering. Trains arrived full of corpses, towns turned on themselves, children were lost, women abducted, the countryside ran red. Gandhi, who had always believed in religious unity, now saw his worst fears realised. And it wasn't under British rule, It was in the first moments of Indian self-rule. He moved through these wounded landscapes like a pilgrim. He was not there to offer solutions, just a presence in the communities. He prayed with both Hindus and Muslims. He urged them to see one another not as enemies, but as brothers. His voice was tired, sometimes barely audible, but it still carried weight. In some cities, his very arrival was enough to stop the riots. In others, it was not. He did not blame the people entirely. He knew that fear, once planted, grows quickly. But he was saddened, deeply so, that freedom had come at such a price. What kind of freedom is this, he asked, when people cannot walk safely in their own country? For Gandhi, liberty without compassion was not liberty at all. The British had left, but hatred had remained. In Delhi too, tension simmered. Refugees flooded the city, camps overflowed, mobs formed, rumours spread, violence hovered like a shadow, just out of sight. And Gandhi, in his 70s, already thin and weakened from years of fasting and travel, once again prepared himself. He believed that peace could not be imposed from above. It had to be chosen, moment by the people themselves. And so he asked them to choose again. Not just freedom, but love. By the winter of 1947, Gandhi was more frail than ever. His steps were slower, his body lighter, and his voice often reduced to a whisper. But his will remained unshaken. The country, now free in name, still trembled with anger. In Delhi, religious tensions flared once more. Mobs formed, homes were burned. The new nation, barely months old, was already fighting with itself. Gandhi responded in the only way he knew how. He began another fast, a vow to refuse food until the violence stopped. It was not meant as punishment. It was a call to conscience. "Do not let me die," he told the people, "unless you have restored peace among yourselves." And something remarkable happened. Leaders of different communities came together. Pledges were made, weapons were surrendered. The riots, for a time, ceased. It was as if the force of his own suffering had momentarily absorbed the fury of a city. But Gandhi's stand came at a cost. To many, he had become a symbol of peace, but to a few, he had become a target of resentment. Some Hindus viewed his gestures toward Muslims as betrayal. They believed he had given too much, asked too little in return, and weakened the Hindu cause in the name of unity. Gandhi had always believed that truth must be pursued even in solitude. But now, solitude was closing in. He spent his final days in Delhi, living in the home of a friend, sleeping on a simple mattress, rising before dawn for prayer. He wrote letters, he met with leaders, and each evening, at 5 p.m, he walked slowly across the garden to his prayer meeting, supported on either side by companions, his hands resting lightly on their arms. On January 30th, 1948, the sun was low in the sky. Gandhi had just finished a conversation and was late for his evening prayers. As he crossed the garden at Birla House, a small crowd had gathered. People bowed, some reached out to touch his feet. Gandhi smiled gently, whispering blessings. And then from within the crowd came 3 shots. The sound was sharp but brief. Gandhi collapsed, murmuring the name of God. Hey Ram. His last breath left him in silence. The man who had brought down an empire without raising a sword had died with no resistance at all. News of his death spread across India like a wave of stillness. Cities fell silent. People wept openly in the streets. In villages, radios played mournful tributes. Schools closed, shops shuttered. Even those who had once opposed him felt the weight of his absence. The father of the nation, as many now called him, had fallen. His body was cremated on the banks of the Yamuna River, wrapped in a simple cloth, carried through a sea of mourners. Ashes were divided and sent across the country, poured into rivers and scattered at sea. There was no monument yet, but everywhere he had been, people remembered, in the lines of a prayer, in the slow turn of a spinning wheel, in the space between hatred and forgiveness. Gandhi had said more than once that he wished to live until he could no longer be useful, that he did not fear death, that his life belonged to others, and when the time came, he would leave it as one leaves a worn garment. He left gently, without bitterness. He was no warrior chasing triumph, only a man who had witnessed much. His strength was quiet, carried in his presence rather than imposed through force. His voice is quiet now, but his example remains. When the fire burned low on the banks of the Yamuna, and Gandhi's ashes were scattered into the rivers and seas, his body may have vanished, but his presence did not. In the days, months, and years that followed, his influence continued to ripple outward, not in the forceful way of rulers or generals, but in the manner of ideas that settle into hearts and remain there. Around the world, people who had never met him began to speak his name, not as a symbol of India alone, but as a guide to something more enduring, a way of confronting injustice without hatred, of holding firm without lashing out, of choosing dignity without dominance. In the United States, a young Baptist preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. was introduced to Gandhi's writings while leading the Montgomery bus boycott. He read of the Salt March, of Satyagraha, of civil resistance rooted in love. And in those pages, he saw a path forward. Years later, King would call Gandhi the guiding light of our technique of non-violent social change. His marches, his speeches, his calls for justice, all bore the imprint of Gandhi's influence, refracted through the lens of American struggle. In South Africa, where Gandhi had once faced racial discrimination on a train platform, another leader rose. Nelson Mandela, imprisoned for decades under apartheid, studied Gandhi's South African campaigns. Though he would later say that non-violence was not always sufficient for his context, Mandela credited Gandhi with teaching the power of moral authority and the need to combine resistance with reconciliation. Across continents, Gandhi's legacy became a blueprint, a reference point, a question. What if power could be held without violence? What if change could come through conscience instead of conquest? But Gandhi's legacy did not only live abroad. In India, he was called Bapu, father. His birthday, October the 2nd, became a national holiday. His image adorned currency, textbooks, stamps, murals, and the walls of classrooms. Children were taught of his simplicity, his spinning wheel, his salt march. Politicians quoted him. Temples honoured him. Roads bore his name. His final words, "He Ram, O God," became sacred in their own way. And yet, like many great figures, Gandhi's memory became both revered and contested. In the years following his death, India changed rapidly. The country industrialized, urbanized, and entered the global economy. New generations, shaped by different struggles, began to see Gandhi's ideas as both timeless and, at times, difficult to reconcile with modern realities. Some saw his strict discipline and moral austerity as too severe. Others questioned his positions on caste, gender, or his conflicts with more radical revolutionaries. In political life, he was sometimes invoked more as symbol than example, his face present, but his philosophy not always followed. And yet, beneath the slogans and ceremonies, Gandhi's essence remained, not as a perfect man, but as a deeply human one. A seeker, a questioner, someone who did not always know, but who always tried to live according to what he believed was right, even when that belief led him into discomfort, doubt, or solitude. He spun his own cloth not for show, but because he believed every hand should be engaged in honest labour. He fasted, not to impress, but to purify his motives. He walked barefoot because he believed that freedom must begin with humility. And he spoke when he spoke, not to win debates, but to invite reflection. The myth of Gandhi can be larger than the man, but the man, when we pause and look closely, was more compelling than any myth. He laughed often, even at himself. He changed his mind. He admitted mistakes. He listened carefully to those who disagreed. And while he never claimed to be a saint, he lived in such a way that others began to believe one could live with purpose without perfection. In many ways, Gandhi's influence is now ambient, no longer tied to a single nation or movement, but woven into how we think about conscience and resistance. In protests around the world, from climate marches to human rights campaigns, you can still see traces of his approach, signs quoting his words, sit-ins modelled after his methods, the insistence that justice need not be loud to be powerful. Even beyond activism, his lifestyle has found echoes in a modern world that often feels too fast, too complex, too distracted. In recent years, people have returned to ideas Gandhi practiced long ago: voluntary simplicity, sustainable living, mindful eating, ethical consumption. His spinning wheel has become a metaphor, not just for self-reliance, but for slowness, for choosing care over convenience. And in spiritual spaces too, his influence lingers, not in formal religion, but in the personal practice of stillness, truthfulness, and non-harming. His belief that each person must search for truth, not in books alone, but in life, in service, in reflection, in the struggle to align values with action, continues to resonate with those on their own inner path. He did not leave behind an empire, he left behind an example. Not a path that must be followed exactly, but a path that reminds us to walk with care, to notice the suffering of others, to ask whether our daily choices reflect what we claim to believe. And perhaps most of all, he reminds us that real change often begins in small places, in the home, at the table, in the silence before a decision, in the space between thought and response. His spinning wheel has long stopped turning. The sandals he wore have long since worn away, but the footsteps remain. The world is quieter now than it was in his time, and yet somehow just as loud. The spinning wheels are still, the rallies dispersed. The voices that once filled city squares now echoes in archives and stories. But if you listen closely, if you slow down long enough to notice, something remains. Maybe it's in the sound of bare feet on a dusty road, or the feel of fabric woven by hand. Maybe it's in the memory of a man seated cross-legged on a mat, deep in thought, surrounded by silence rather than power. Or perhaps it's something even smaller, the choice to speak gently when anger would be easier, the decision to go without so that someone else may have enough. He left behind no wealth, no palace, no monument of stone, but he left behind a way of being. A question asked again and again in different languages, different struggles, different lifetimes. What does it mean to live in truth? The answers, if there are any, do not arrive all at once. They come in moments, in restraint, in tenderness, in the refusal to let cruelty go unanswered. And so we return to the image once more. A man walking slowly toward evening prayers, his shawl wrapped close against the wind, his eyes calm, his steps steady, nothing urgent, nothing grand, just presence. And somewhere in the distance, the wheel continues to turn. There is something more to be found in dwelling here, in the softer details that filled the spaces between the turning points of history, in the everyday moments that shaped such a life. Gandhi would rise each morning before dawn, not because duty demanded it, but because his body had learned the rhythm over decades, the way a tree learns to bend toward light. In those quiet hours at Sabarmati, before the heat pressed down and the day's correspondence arrived, he would sit with his spinning wheel, the charkha that had become as familiar to his hands as his own heartbeat. The cotton would flow between his fingers, white and soft, transforming itself thread by thread into something useful, something that could be woven into cloth, into the simple white khadi that became his uniform, his statement, his daily act of quiet rebellion against an economy built on distant mills and foreign profits. The rhythm of the wheel was the rhythm of his thoughts, steady and circular, returning always to the same concerns, the same questions that had occupied him for years. How to live simply in a complicated world. How to speak truth when lies seemed more convenient. How to remain gentle when faced with violence, patient when confronted with hatred, hopeful when everything seemed to suggest that hope was foolish. These thoughts would circle through his mind as the wheel turned, as the thread accumulated, as the sun rose slowly over the ashram grounds where others were beginning their own daily routines, their own quiet acts of creation and contemplation. After the spinning came the walking, those long, slow journeys on foot that carried him from village to village, from meeting to meeting, from one conversation to another. His feet had covered thousands of miles over the years, from the dusty roads of Gujarat to the crowded streets of Delhi, from the salt flats of Dandi to the railway platforms where crowds gathered to catch a glimpse of the small man in white, who had somehow become the embodiment of their hopes for freedom. But it was not the destinations that mattered so much as the walking itself, the steady rhythm of one foot in front of the other, the way the landscape unfolded slowly around him, revealing its secrets gradually, naturally, without hurry or urgency. He would stop often during these walks, not because he was tired, but because something had caught his attention. A farmer working in his field, bent over the crops with the same patient dedication that Gandhi brought to his spinning. A child playing in the dust, laughing at some private joke, reminding him that joy could flourish even in the midst of hardship. An old woman sitting in the shade of her doorway, her eyes holding the accumulated wisdom of decades, the quiet knowledge that comes from watching seasons change, watching children grow, watching the endless cycle of planting and harvest, of birth and death, of struggle and rest. These encounters were rarely dramatic, rarely the stuff of newspaper headlines or political speeches. They were simply moments of connection, brief exchanges of recognition between one human being and another. The farmer would look up from his work and nod. The child would stop playing and stare with wide eyes at the strange man in white, who walked so slowly, so deliberately, as if he had all the time in the world. The old woman would smile and perhaps offer a cup of water, and they would sit together in comfortable silence, sharing the shade and the simple pleasure of rest after effort. Back at the ashram, the days followed their own gentle rhythm. Meals were simple affairs, bowls of rice and dal, and vegetables grown in their own gardens, prepared by hands that understood that cooking too was a form of prayer, a way of transforming the gifts of the earth into nourishment for the body and soul. Gandhi would eat slowly, chewing each mouthful thoroughly, not from any dietary theory, but from a natural reverence for the food itself, the long chain of sun and rain and soil and human labor that had brought it to his bowl. The conversations over these meals were often about practical matters, how to improve the gardens, whether the new volunteers were settling in well, what news had come from the outside world, what developments in the ongoing struggle for independence, what responses to the latest acts of civil disobedience. But even these serious discussions had a quality of timelessness about them, as if the participants understood that the work they were doing was part of something larger than any immediate crisis or opportunity, part of a slow transformation that would outlast any individual campaign or victory or defeat. In the afternoons, when the heat made outdoor work difficult, Gandhi would often retreat to his simple room to write. Letters to friends and followers, articles for Young India, responses to the endless stream of questions and requests and criticisms that came his way. His handwriting was careful and deliberate, each word chosen with the same attention he brought to his spinning, his walking, his eating. He wrote as he lived, without haste but without hesitation, each sentence building on the last, each paragraph part of a larger argument or explanation or invitation to think differently about familiar problems. The writing was another form of meditation, another way of clarifying his own thoughts while attempting to communicate with others. He would pause often, his pen hovering over the paper, not because he was uncertain about what to say, but because he wanted to say it precisely, exactly, in a way that might bridge the gap between one mind and another, one heart and another. The afternoon light would slant through his window, illuminating the simple furnishings of his room. The books stacked neatly on their shelves, the few personal possessions he had allowed himself, each one chosen for its usefulness, its beauty, its connection to someone or something he loved. As evening approached, the ashram would gather for prayers, voices joining together in ancient songs and chants that seemed to rise naturally from the earth itself, from the accumulated devotion of generations who had found in these words and melodies a way of expressing what could not be expressed, of touching what could not be touched, of reaching toward that which was always present, but always just beyond the grasp of ordinary consciousness. Gandhi's voice would blend with the others, neither leading nor following, but simply participating in this daily act of communal recognition, this acknowledgement of mystery and gratitude and hope. After prayers came the evening meal, another simple gathering around simple food, and then the gradual settling into night. Gandhi would often take one more walk before bed, a slow circuit of the ashram grounds, checking on the gardens, listening to the sounds of the night, breathing in the cooler air that brought relief from the day's heat. The stars would emerge one by one overhead, the same stars that had watched over countless other evening walks, countless other moments of quiet reflection, countless other lives lived in the faith that small acts of love and courage and truth-telling could somehow, mysteriously, change the world. And then to bed, to the simple cot in the simple room, to the sleep that came easily to one whose days were full of purposeful activity, whose conscience was clear, whose heart was at peace with the choices he had made and would make again tomorrow, and the day after that, and all the days that remained to him in this long, slow work of transformation that he had somehow been called to undertake, this patient, persistent, gentle revolution that began each morning with the turning of a wheel and ended each night with the turning of the earth itself beneath the vast canopy of stars. There are moments, even now, when the rhythm of Gandhi's life seems to resurface, not in headlines or declarations, but in the small habits of those who live without needing to announce why, in the quiet of early morning, when someone chooses to walk instead of ride, to wait instead of hurry, to listen instead of speak, as though the old rhythms had simply shifted shape and continued on without needing recognition. Somewhere, in a room without decoration, a wooden floor creaks beneath bare feet. The light is soft, perhaps just beginning to filter through linen curtains. A spinning wheel rests in the corner, unmoving, but present, its silence speaking more than its motion ever could. The cloth once spun has long been folded. The fingers that once pulled it into shape have gone still. But the idea remains, stretched thin across time, too quiet to be taught, too real to be forgotten. And still there are footsteps, not hurried, not sharp, just the steady hush of sandals over dust, the trace of movement across a country once split by lines on paper, but still bound by the memory of someone who refused to draw enemies where there had once been neighbours. He walked through villages that no longer exist. He knelt beside people whose names were never written down, and though the world has moved on, the walk has not ended. It simply continues elsewhere, unspoken, a kind of motion that remembers without looking back. Perhaps it's in the hands of someone kneading dough at dawn, or gathering water in silence from a roadside pump. Perhaps it's in the soft call of morning prayer, rising over rooftops before the traffic wakes. The things he believed in were not things you could hold truth, non-violence, humility, but somehow they still rest in the shape of gestures, in the cadence of those who don't call attention to themselves but choose, again and again, to live with care. There's a calm that follows someone who has lived deliberately, not the kind that demands quiet, but the kind that creates it. Gandhi didn't build systems, he didn't carve boundaries or leave behind complex mechanisms. He lived, he watched, he chose. And in doing so, he reminded others that they could do the same, that no one is too small to be part of something larger, and no moment is too ordinary to be approached with intention. You can imagine the ashram in the afternoon, the slow sweep of a broom across the stone courtyard, the sound of goats nearby, the click of a door left slightly ajar. Meals are simple, mostly rice and lentils, served without flourish. Conversation is soft, sometimes absent. Time passes in long stretches, not idle, but unhurried. And somewhere in that rhythm, in that choice to go without hurry, lies something that resists forgetting. It is easy to think of influence in terms of impact, laws changed, empires shaken, but Gandhi's influence feels more like a trace left on fabric after it has been folded, or the scent of something faint that lingers long after it has gone. The way one person can shape how another stands, how another breathes, how another waits, not by force, not by instruction, just by example. There are images that persist, not because they were photographed, but because they carry meaning beyond their frame. A man crouched beside a sick child, a letter written with trembling hands, a bowl of water placed gently at someone else's feet. Sometimes we imagine him standing still, but he was always in motion, not fast but constant, a slow arc through a shifting world. And now, long after the physical journey has ended, The movement continues, not as a march, not as a cause, but as a kind of rhythm that hums below the surface of people who have never seen his face, but have inherited his question: how should a person live? And so the spinning continues, not of thread, but of attention, of stories passed from voice to voice, of habits born not of rules, but of noticing, of the quiet bravery required to live gently in a world that does not always reward it. The cloth may unravel, the wheel may stop turning, but the gesture remains. Some things are not remembered through fact or date, but through repetition, like a hand reaching for the same bowl each morning, a line of prayer repeated without thought, the way sunlight touches the same stone at the same hour, day after day. Gandhi lived his life in repetitions like these, not to escape time, but to move with it, not to resist change, but to ground it. In the stillness of morning, before the world had fully woken, he would rise quietly, without alarm, without disturbance. There was no rush. The body moved slowly, water was poured for washing, clothes folded neatly, prayer beads turned, not as display, but as rhythm, each movement a decision, each gesture an invitation to stay present. Outside, the air was often cool, the sounds were few, a bird perhaps, or the creak of wood, or a distant voice rising in early chant. The earth beneath his feet felt no different than it had the day before, but each day he walked as though it were new. That was the practice, not change for its own sake, but attention, to live each moment, as if it mattered, to believe that truth could be pursued not in great declarations, but in the way one stirred tea or swept a floor. And somewhere in that practice, something larger took shape. Not loud, not quick, but unmistakable. His strength was not in the speeches he gave, but in the pauses between them. Not in the protests alone, but in how he carried himself afterward, in how he greeted others, in how he let silence speak, when words would only cloud. Sometimes it is easier to tell a story through its endings, to say what was accomplished, what changed, what moved. But Gandhi's life resists that, not because it lacked impact, but because the impact continues, less like a line drawn, and more like a current moving underground, quiet but persistent. The same way one might not remember the exact shape of a tree's shadow, only the sense of calm it gave. Gandhi's presence lingers not in data, but in atmosphere. In the way a teacher sets down their book before speaking, in the way a stranger holds a door just a second longer than needed, in the way someone chooses not to raise their voice when anger surges forward. These are not laws, they are echoes. There were no bodyguards around him at the end, no fortress, no separation from the people he moved among. He was never untouchable, never unreachable, and that closeness became its own kind of protection, not against violence, but against indifference. He had decided long ago that he would not live behind walls, that to lead, truly lead, meant to remain exposed, vulnerable to failure, available to suffering, open to change. That choice, the choice to stay open, can be harder than any fast, harder than any march. And yet he made it, again and again, each time he met with someone who disagreed, each time he stood between enemies and asked them not to fight, each time he took blame rather than assign it, not because he was right, but because he believed that someone had to be the first to yield. And even now, long after his body has gone, long after the slogans and the ceremonies and the pages in history books have settled into dust, that same choice still arises, in boardrooms, in villages, in homes filled with tension. He wore white, not for symbolism alone, but for simplicity. He walked not for spectacle, but for slowness. He fasted not for protest, but for alignment. And in these acts, he showed a kind of power that did not require force, a kind of authority that did not require title, the sort of influence that moves through example, not decree. And so the thread continues, long after the wheel has stopped, winding not through cloth now, but through gestures, through the ways people choose to live their small ordinary moments, the kinds of moments that are easy to overlook, but make up the shape of a life. A hand reaches for a broom, a pot of rice is stirred, a letter is written in longhand slowly, by candlelight. The questions Gandhi asked remain not because they are unanswered, but because they are still being lived, still being worked out, still unfolding, and perhaps they always will be. It's possible that somewhere, In a room with open windows and nothing mechanical to measure the time, someone still rises before the sun and moves quietly through their morning without speaking. The floor is cool. The air smells faintly of wood smoke or rain. There is no rush to begin the day, only a series of movements that feel familiar, not inherited through instruction, but through instinct, as though something once observed in someone else has lived on quietly in the body. There are still places where shoes are left at the door, and meals are eaten cross-legged, where prayer begins not with volume, but with breath, where spinning wheels sit unused, yet still whole, not for decoration but for memory, and if no one touches them now, that's all right. It's enough that they remain. Their stillness speaks. He moved through the world as if walking was a kind of language, not linear, not logical, but rhythmic. There was meaning in the pace, in the way his feet found the earth without effort, in the way he stopped not to pose, but to listen. Even now, long after the road has forgotten his footprints, there are paths worn by others trying to walk the same way. And still the questions remain, not spoken, not written, but felt. What does it mean to resist without hatred? What does it mean to belong to others without possessing them? What does it mean to offer your presence as a form of care, even when there's nothing to say, even when there's nothing to fix? These are not lessons easily passed from one to another. They do not live in books or speeches alone. They live in gestures, in glances, in the decision not to interrupt, in the space someone makes for another to be fully seen. There is an art to withholding judgment. Gandhi practiced it in conversation, in conflict, in disappointment. He did not always succeed. He made mistakes, said too much or not enough. But again and again, he returned to the effort to hold another's pain without rearranging it, the effort to live truth without needing to perform it. And though the specifics of his struggle may belong to his time, the practice remains. Not everyone who follows him carries a banner. Some carry only a memory, faint and undefined, of someone who lived with their values stitched so tightly into their days that you could see them even in silence, especially in silence. There are homes now, far from the cities he knew, where a candle burns not for light, but for rhythm, where a meal is shared without distraction, where a window is opened, not for air, but because something about the morning feels sacred. These are not grand acts, they are small patterns of care, and in those patterns, something of him lingers. The body ages, the world turns, movements shift, but the example of a life lived without armour, a life given over to something larger than ego or fear, that doesn't fade. It stretches, slow and quiet, across generations, like the slow settling of dust, like the feeling left behind when someone kind has exited a room. He left behind no doctrine, only questions, and though the shape of those questions has changed, no longer about empires or colonial power, no longer about salt or spinning or prison,